Everyone is watching the missile traffic over the Persian Gulf. They're missing what's happening underneath it. For the first time since 1974, ships are paying for safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz in a currency that is not the US dollar. Not as a backroom workaround. Not as a forecast in someone's white paper. As an operational toll charged in yuan and stablecoins administered by Iran's Revolutionary Guard and documented by Bloomberg on April 1st of this year. The starting price, according to the reporting, is around $1 per barrel of oil on board, settled in Chinese currency or digital assets, in exchange for an Iranian naval escort through the waterway that carries roughly 20% of the world's seaborne oil. Think about that for a moment. The most important choke point in the global energy system is now running on a payment rail that does not touch the dollar. And almost nobody in the West is treating that as the story. That's the thesis of this breakdown. Not that the dollar is collapsing, not that the yuan has won, but that an arrangement Henry Kissinger negotiated with the Saudi royal family in 1974, the arrangement that turned the dollar into the only acceptable currency for oil and, by extension, the world's reserve unit, that arrangement just stopped functioning at the place where it mattered most. And once a system stops functioning in one location, the question is no longer if the rules are changing. The question is how fast. Before we get into the mechanics, let's anchor why this matters to you, sitting in Phoenix or Pittsburgh or Charlotte, watching this from thousands of miles away. The petrodollar system is the reason a country with $39 trillion in debt can still borrow at 4.97% on the long end instead of 8 or 9. It is the reason the dollar in your bank account buys imported electronics, foreign cars, and overseas vacations at prices that, by any rational measure, should be much higher. It is the structural subsidy underneath the American standard of living, and it has been running quietly in the background for 50 years. When that subsidy gets renegotiated, at gunpoint, at a choke point in real time, the bill comes due in places ordinary households can feel. It shows up at the gas pump first, then in grocery prices because diesel sets the cost of moving every box on every truck. Then in mortgage rates because long-end treasury yields move with global confidence in dollar settlement. And eventually, if the trend hardens, it shows up in retirement portfolios that have priced 50 years of dollar dominance into every assumption about real returns and inflation hedges. So when we talk about what's happening at Hormuz, we are not talking about an abstract foreign policy story. We are talking about the operating rules of the system that quietly funds the way Americans live. Now let's get into what's actually happening on the water. According to Bloomberg's April 1st report, the toll system works like this. A tanker, usually loaded with Gulf crude bound for an Asian buyer, sits at anchor in the Persian Gulf, sometimes for weeks. The strait has been largely impassable to commercial traffic since February 28th of this year, when escalation between Iran and the West shut routine transit down. The IEA, in its April oil market report, called the resulting supply disruption the largest in history, with global oil supply falling 10.1 million barrels per day in March alone to 97 million barrels per day total, a number the agency has never had to publish before. A representative, sometimes through Pakistani intermediaries, according to Bloomberg's reporting, approaches the tanker operator with an offer. Pay a toll in yuan or in stablecoins calibrated to the cargo on board. Roughly $1 per barrel is the starting figure cited in the reporting. In exchange, an Iranian Navy vessel escorts the tanker out of the strait and into the Gulf of Oman. The Pakistani flag detail is one of the more remarkable parts of the story, and it deserves a closer look. Bloomberg reported that Iran agreed to allow 20 Pakistani-flagged vessels through the strait, and Islamabad began reaching out to some of the world's largest commodity traders to see if they had vessels that could temporarily sail under a Pakistani flag. The country has only a small number of flagged ships in the Gulf normally, so what we are watching is the construction of an ad hoc third-party arbitration layer, a flag of convenience system, retrofitted onto a war zone with payment terms enforced by the Revolutionary Guard. It is improvisational, and that is precisely why it matters. The most consequential changes in monetary history almost never arrive as treaties. They arrive as workarounds that stop being temporary. The Bloomberg follow-up on April 3rd reported that shares of Chinese cross-border payment companies rose on the news after the Chinese Commerce Ministry acknowledged yuan was being used. By April 9th, Bloomberg was reporting that Iran's broader sanctions-busting crypto ambitions were expanding on the back of these toll payments, turning a choke point emergency into a structural payment rail experiment. Daily News Egypt, citing the same Bloomberg reporting on April 4th, identified the Revolutionary Guard explicitly as the administering body. So the chain of custody on the story is not a single anonymous source. It's a multi-day, multi-outlet primary source confirmed sequence. Notice what this is and what it isn't. It isn't a treaty. It isn't a BRICS press release. It isn't a long-term currency swap. It is a working, live, operational toll system in a place that handles a fifth of the world's oil, settled in everything except the currency the entire post-1974 oil market was built on. Here's the part most analysts are getting wrong. They're treating this as a temporary crisis measure, as if when the conflict cools and the strait reopens, the old arrangement simply resumes. History suggests it doesn't work that way. Once a payment system has been demonstrated to work at scale, once tanker operators, commodity traders, and central banks have wired yuan and confirmed stablecoin transactions for real cargo, the precedent doesn't unwind. It becomes infrastructure. It gets a software interface. Compliance teams write playbooks for it. And the next time a chokepoint event happens, call it a pipeline dispute, a sanctions cascade, a sovereign default, the playbook gets pulled off the shelf. That is how monetary regimes actually change, not in a single dramatic moment, in a series of operational precedents that nobody bothered to reverse. And that brings us to the second act of this story, because to understand what's been broken, you have to understand what was built in 1974 and what came right before it. The petrodollar architecture didn't appear in a vacuum. It was a direct response to the 1973 Arab oil embargo, the moment when OPEC, in retaliation for Western support of Israel during the Yom Kippur War, cut production and quadrupled the price of crude. The embargo lasted from October 1973 until March 1974, and it nearly broke the post-war American economy. Gas lines stretched around city blocks. Inflation surged. The link between U.S. energy security and Middle Eastern politics was no longer abstract. In June of 1974, 3 months after the embargo was lifted, President Richard Nixon, working through Treasury Secretary William Simon and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, finalized a set of agreements with Saudi Arabia that became the operating constitution of the modern dollar system. The State Department's own historical record documents the negotiations, the letters between Nixon and King Faisal, the meetings with Prince Fahd, the careful choreography around an OPEC arrangement that everyone in the room knew had to be replaced with something more durable. Simon's role here is often understated in casual retellings. As Treasury Secretary, he was the architect of the recycling mechanism, the part of the deal that took Saudi oil revenues and routed them back into U.S. Treasury auctions through a special off-the-books accommodation that allowed Saudi Arabia to buy treasuries directly from Treasury outside the normal competitive auction process. That arrangement remained partially classified for decades. The deal, in plain terms, was this. Saudi Arabia would price its oil in U.S. dollars and only U.S. dollars. The dollars Saudi Arabia accumulated from oil sales would be recycled, invested back into U.S. Treasury securities and into the American economy more broadly. In exchange, the United States would provide security guarantees, advanced weapons, and the implicit promise that the Saudi monarchy would have a powerful patron. The genius of the arrangement, and the part that gets lost in casual retelling, is that the deal didn't just affect Saudi Arabia. Because Saudi Arabia was the swing producer of OPEC, and because OPEC was the price setter for global oil, every other oil exporter, from Iran to Venezuela to Nigeria, found it administratively easier to also price in dollars. Every importer, Japan, Germany, eventually China, had to hold dollar reserves to buy oil. The dollar became the only ticket to the global energy market. And once it became that, it became the natural reserve currency for everything else. For trade in commodities, for cross-border banking, for sovereign reserves. This is what economists call a network effect. It wasn't enforced by treaty. It was enforced by convenience. And for 50 years, the convenience held. Notice what was always implicit in that arrangement, though. The dollar's role in oil settlement was conditional on two things. First, that the United States could project enough power to keep the system stable. Second, that no major choke point in the energy system would be administered by an actor willing to charge in something else. For 50 years, both conditions held. The American Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Bahrain since 1995, kept the Gulf open. Iran was contained through sanctions and deterrence. Russia, even at its most aggressive in earlier decades, sold oil priced in dollars even when it occasionally took payment in other currencies. The architecture flexed but never broke. What's happening at Hormuz right now is the first time both conditions have failed simultaneously. The United States is not, at the moment, projecting the kind of unilateral power that keeps the strait open by default. And the actor who controls transit, Iran, through the Revolutionary Guard, is not just willing to charge in non-dollar units. It is enforcing it. This is the part that historians will mark. Not the missiles, not the diplomatic statements, the toll receipt, denominated in yuan, on a tanker carrying Saudi crude bound for a Chinese refinery. That's the document that closes the chapter Kissinger opened. Let me push back on my own thesis for a moment, because the strongest defense of the existing dollar order deserves to be on the table. Critics of the de-dollarization narrative, and there are serious ones, not just channel fillers, point out correctly that the dollar's share of global FX reserves has only declined gradually, from around 71% in 2001 to roughly 59% by the end of 2024, according to IMF COFR data. They point out that foreign holdings of U.S. Treasuries hit record highs in February 2026, according to the Treasury's TIC report released on April 15th. They point out that even when oil is settled in yuan, the yuan itself is often converted back into dollars at the next leg of the transaction, because dollar liquidity is still unmatched. They point to the Schwab analysis published earlier this year, which argues there is no viable alternative to the dollar with the depth, transparency, and rule of law infrastructure of the U.S. Treasury market. All of that is true. And it's why the careful framing here is not the dollar is dead. It's that one of the operational pillars of the dollar system, exclusive oil settlement, has cracked at the most important choke point, and the cracks are not theoretical anymore. They are running on Bloomberg terminals. There's a deeper point underneath the rebuttal, though, and it's worth sitting with. Reserve currencies don't usually collapse. They erode. The British pound was the world's reserve currency for over a century, and even after the United States economically surpassed Britain in the 1870s, the pound retained its reserve status until World War II forced the issue. Status is sticky. Status is also not the same as monopoly. What changes first is not the share of reserves, it's the share of new transactions, and that is exactly where Hormuz fits in. Now let's talk about what the real economy data already shows. In May of 2026, Saudi crude supply to China dropped to a record low of approximately 645,000 barrels per day, according to data tracked by trade flow analysts following the relationship. For the first 2 months of this year, Russia overtook Saudi Arabia as China's largest oil supplier, with Russian purchases surging 24% year over year per China Global South Project reporting. Russia, of course, has been settling its oil sales to China in yuan and rubles since Western sanctions in 2022 forced the issue. The infrastructure for non-dollar oil settlement, in other words, has been operational between Moscow and Beijing for nearly 4 years already. What changed in 2026 is that the same rails are now handling Gulf cargo, not just Russian cargo. This is the part of the story that requires you to zoom out. The Russia-China yuan oil channel was treated when it opened as a sanctioned economy workaround, a forced adaptation by countries cut off from the Western financial system. The framing was that yuan oil was for pariahs and the dollar remained the currency of legitimate commerce. What Hormuz proves is that the same rails are now available to ships flagged in Pakistan carrying Saudi crude bound for Chinese refiners. The rails are no longer limited to sanctioned trade. They are general-purpose infrastructure. It's worth understanding how the plumbing actually works, because the difference between SWIFT, the dominant Western payment messaging system, and CIAPS, the Chinese cross-border interbank payment system launched in 2015, is at the heart of all of this. SWIFT is a messaging layer that runs on top of correspondent banking. In practice, almost every cross-border dollar transaction touches a New York-based correspondent bank, which is what gives U.S. sanctions their global reach. CIPS, by contrast, is a settlement system that processes yuan transactions without requiring a New York hop. When Iran charges yuan tolls, those payments don't pass through American jurisdiction. They settle directly. That is the technical detail underneath the whole story. So what we are watching is not a single event. It is a convergence. The Russian yuan oil channel that opened in 2022. The Saudi-China negotiations that have been moving slowly toward partial yuan settlement for 3 years. The CIAPS infrastructure that quietly tripled in volume between 2020 and 2024. And now the Iranian Tollbooth that has demonstrated yuan and stablecoins can clear oil-related payments at industrial scale in a war zone under sanctions pressure. Each of these alone is a story. Together they're a system. And the central banks of the world have noticed. The World Gold Council's Q1 2026 report published last week showed central banks bought 244 tons of gold in the first quarter alone, the fastest pace in over a year and well above the long-run average. Some other versions of the data, including measurements from a different methodology in the same report, put the figure even higher at 337 tons for Q1, marking the strongest first quarter on record. The price of gold hit $5,405 per ounce in January. The quarterly average set a new record at $4,173. Here's the question that follows. Why are the people who manage the world's currency reserves, the most conservative, most slow-moving institutions in finance, buying gold at a record clip while telling their citizens that everything is fine? They're hedging the same thing we're talking about. Not the immediate collapse of the dollar, the slow structural erosion of its monopoly on monetary settlement. Watching central banks buy gold while telling citizens inflation is under control is the kind of contradiction history tends to remember. Let me bring you back to the curiosity gap I opened with. I told you everyone is watching the missile traffic over the Gulf and missing what's happening underneath it. Here's the payoff. The missile traffic is the cover. The toll system is the thing. Wars at choke points come and go. Strait closures get resolved. Diplomatic breakthroughs happen. What does not unwind is institutional memory. Every shipping company that paid a yuan toll now has the operational know-how to do it again. Every Chinese cross-border payment processor that handled those tolls now has a working playbook. Every commodity trader that watched a tanker get escorted out of the strait by an Iranian gunboat after a yuan payment cleared has learned that yuan-settled energy is not a hypothetical anymore. It's a tool on the desk. And that institutional memory is what changes the long-run probability of dollar settlement remaining the default. Not next year, not even in 5 years. But in the time horizon that pension funds and central bank reserve managers actually plan around 15, 20, 30 years, the probability has shifted. So what does the forward picture look like? Let me give you the range that serious analysts are watching because nobody honest can tell you exactly how this resolves. In the near term, the next 6 to 12 months, expect oil price volatility to remain elevated. Brent has already swung from $111 in mid-April to $90 by April 18th to a brief spike at $126, all in a matter of weeks per oilprice.com and Al Jazeera reporting. Goldman, in publicly reported forecasts, has flagged that another month of Hormuz disruption pushes Brent above $100 throughout 2026. Citigroup set a 3-month WTI target around $104 in their March research note. The range to watch is wide because the underlying signal, chokepoint instability, is binary, not gradual. Either the strait functions or it doesn't, and the price gaps between those two states are huge. There's a domestic angle here that doesn't get enough attention. Every $10 sustained move in Brent translates roughly into about a 25-cent move at the American gasoline pump within a few weeks. The math from the Energy Information Administration's historical pass-through data is direct. So Brent moving from $80 to $110, which is roughly what 2026 has delivered, is not abstract. It's an extra dollar a gallon every fill until the choke point stabilizes. In the medium term, 2 to 5 years, watch the share of Chinese oil imports that settles in yuan. China's Commerce Ministry has now publicly acknowledged yuan settlement at Hormuz tolls, and Financial Post reporting in April quoted Chinese government-affiliated scholars saying yuan-denominated crude oil volumes have already picked up due to the conflict. If that share rises from low single digits today toward the 15 to 20% range, the petrodollar architecture transitions from dominant to shared. That's a different world. In the long term, 5 to 20 years, the question is whether U.S. Treasury yields can stay where they are when the structural demand for dollars from oil-importing countries weakens. The math is uncomfortable. The Congressional Budget Office, in its 2026 to 2036 outlook published earlier this year, projects federal debt rising to 120% of GDP by 2036 under current policy. That projection assumes roughly current borrowing costs. If the structural bid for dollars from oil importer reserve managers weakens by even 50 basis points on long-end yields, the interest expense line on the federal budget goes from challenging to genuinely destabilizing. American households experience that math through mortgage rates that drift higher than they would have in the old system, through grocery and gasoline prices that build in a permanent geopolitical risk premium, and through retirement portfolios that have to work harder for the same real return. This is where the contrast lands. American households were promised implicitly that the dollar's role in the global energy market was permanent, a kind of inheritance that didn't need to be earned again. The strongest counterargument here is that policy can adapt, that energy independence and shale production reduce the strategic exposure, and that the dollar's network effects in finance run far deeper than oil alone. The shale revolution is a real shield. The depth of U.S. capital markets is a real shield. All of that is true. But the observable outcome, a choke point running on yuan tolls, central banks buying gold at record pace, foreign sovereign holders adjusting their reserve baskets, tells you the inheritance is being repriced, regardless of what was promised. This was avoidable in a sense. The decisions that reduced U.S. presence at the Gulf, that allowed sanctions architecture to multiply until non-aligned countries built parallel rails, that let fiscal credibility slip until rating agencies started warning publicly, those were policy choices made over decades by multiple administrations of both parties. Pretending otherwise in either direction is just partisan theater. The cost of those choices is now sitting on a tanker in the Strait of Hormuz, denominated in renminbi. Let's tie this back to where we started. I told you that the most important choke point in the global energy system is now running on a payment rail that does not touch the dollar. That fact is the operational evidence of a structural shift that academic economists have been measuring for years and that household budgets are about to feel for the first time. The 1974 architecture didn't fail because anyone announced its failure. It failed because at the place where it mattered most, the rules stopped applying. And once rules stop applying in one location, the next choke point, the next pipeline negotiation, the next sovereign wealth fund decision gets made under different assumptions. The petrodollar isn't dying because someone declared war on it. It's dying because the conditions that made it convenient are no longer the conditions of the world. Convenience was the foundation, and convenience was the first thing the choke point took away. The watchers who get this right over the next 5 years won't be the ones predicting collapse. They'll be the ones tracking with discipline the share of global oil that settles outside the dollar, the share of central bank reserves that rotates into gold, and the spread between what officials promise and what tankers actually do. That's the real dashboard. Everything else is noise. If this breakdown helped you understand what's actually happening at Hormuz and why it matters past next week's headlines, the bell icon makes sure you catch the next one. We're tracking the latest TIC data on foreign treasury holdings and what it says about who is really buying the new debt. See you there.